At ThinkLab, we believe that research should do more than just spark ideas. It should create meaningful change. So for every survey completed, we plant a tree. That means that your insights don't just shape the future of the built environment, they help reforest it. It's quick, it's meaningful, and it starts with your voice. Simply click the link in the show notes to get involved in our latest research and grow something bigger than data. Let's design a better future together. Okay, here we go. Mic's on. Sound check's good. So that can only mean one thing. Season 8 of DNA starts now. Now, you might think that the most digitally driven generation in history would want to live their lives entirely online. But what if the opposite is true? What if Gen Alpha's future depends on how we bring them together in person? Today, we explore just that. Welcome to Design Nerds Anonymous, the podcast that sparks curiosity at the intersection of business and design. I'm your host, Amanda Schneider, founder and president at ThinkLab and speaker now featured on TED.com. In this episode, we're talking with someone who spends his life looking around the corner at what's coming next. Mark McCrindle is one of the world's leading experts on generations. He's a demographer, a futurist, fellow TEDx speaker who tracks the trends shaping how we live, work, and gather. The way these new generations think is already shaping the spaces we build. So whether you design them, furnish them, or just exist in them, what Mark has to say today might just change how you see our collective future. And in traditional DNA style, we kick things off by inviting our guests to introduce themselves, plus one word to describe the future they see coming. Meet Mark.
Mark McCrindle. I'm a social researcher based here in Sydney, Australia, and we look at demographics, generational change, and emerging trends to get a handle on the future. And one word to describe the future I see is exciting with this new generation emerging.
Let's dive right into your research. You've been doing this for a while. You've got so much data. So I always like to hear what our guests find most interesting.
Firstly, the name Generation Alpha. The reason that I put that forward as the name for this next generation is obviously we had worked our way through the alphabet. We all know Generation X, which I'm one, and then we had the millennials, also called Generation Y, and then we finished with Generation Z. And by the time 2010 emerged, we have a new generation because each of these generations spans 15 years. And some people will say, oh, it must be Generation A, or it must be the click and go kids or the iGen or something to do with their technology. But look, we're not going back to the start of the alphabet. We don't want to define them by the technology that's here and now, because this is a generation that'll live longer than any previous generation with the longevity booms that we're seeing. Most of them will live into the 22nd century. We don't want to define them by something that's a little blip in time at the moment, right when they're being born. And we don't want to go back to the past because this is the first generation fully born in this 21st century. And that's why I said we've got to have a new naming classification. Sequential naming works well, but let's move off the current alphabet, move to the Greek alphabet. That's what we often do in science. And so we've got Generation Alpha from 2010 to 2024, and then Generation Beta born from this year, 2025 through to 2039. And the benefits of firstly having a name that shifts us from what we had, highlights that we're not going back to the past, it's the start of the new, the next. Secondly, by having 15-year spans of time, rather than just waiting for an event or a circumstance to say, all right, I think that marks the new generation. We should be a little bit more scientific, a bit more rigorous in our approach to generational assessment, and having set spans of years allows for that. We've moved from a biological definition, which a generation used to be, was the span of time from when you're born to when you have children of your own. And if we apply that biological definition today, it's 30 years, because that's the age of women having children. That's too long to think about a whole cohort in one generation. And so we've halved that to the 15-year span. And it also then allows us not only to compare generation by generation because they span the same length of births, but it allows us to prepare for the generations coming, because if we've got an alpha now, we've got a beta to come. And if we've got a beta, then we're going to have a gamma and a delta. And so particularly for planners, for architects, for city developers, they can work out who will inhabit this school or this early learning center or this educational precinct, because they can work out in 2040 or 2050 which the generation will be. And they can start to plan and give a name, give a context, and give something tangible to the future generations by understanding who they are and the names. And it brings a human element to the future. That's why we're big advocates of the generational labeling, of the forward planning, and of understanding the generations to come.
We're just getting started. A quick pause for this short break, and we'll be right back.
Audible's romance collection has something to satisfy every side of you. When it comes to what kind of romance you're into, you don't have to choose just one. Fancy a dalliance with a duke, or maybe a steamy billionaire. You could find a book boyfriend in the city and another one tearing it up on the hockey field. And if nothing on this earth satisfies, you can always find love in another realm. Discover modern rom-coms from authors like Lily Chu and Ali Hazelwood, the latest romantasy series from Sarah J. Maas and Rebecca Yarros, plus Regency favorites like Bridgerton and Outlander. And of course, all the really steamy stuff. Your first great love story is free when you sign up for a free 30-day trial at audible.com/Wondery. That's audible.com/Wondery.
All right, let's get back into it.
Let's talk about that name a little bit, because something I read recently, not from you all, was nicknaming them Gen Polar because of the polarization that's happening. Have you heard that before? Help us debunk that myth.
Yes, I have heard that, and we're in polarized times, but we don't want to just define a generation right now by the zeitgeist of the very moment, because there are cultural moments that come and go, and this is just one at the moment. Just like we didn't want to call them Generation COVID, or the COVIDians as some called them, just because COVID was emerging as they were in their junior years of infant school. It's too short-sighted and it's singular. It's one-dimensional. The trends that we're responding to now that are shaping this generation are multifactorial. Yes, there are social trends, but in their hands, we've got new technology, and the technology trends are transformative. They're growing up in a world of AI, but it's not just technology. We don't want to call them the AI gen, because it's also global trends that are shaping them. And then you've got demographic trends. We've got an aging population. We've got increasing cultural diversity globally. We've got significant shifts in terms of more generations alive and interacting than ever. And so it's the social trends and the technology ones, the global ones and the demographic ones and the technological ones, all of that comes together. And in a multifactorial world influenced by global megatrends, we don't want to take a singular factor and put that label on a generation that are going to live into the 22nd century. That's a little bit short-sighted.
I'm also interested in what the attitudes of this generation are going to be. Are you seeing any trend lines? Like this Gen Polar, I think in my mind comes from the idea that we're all fragmenting as a society. It's only one facet, so I don't want to label them that way either. But what are the characteristics that will define this generation? Maybe different from other generations, or maybe these are some of the things that you've seen trending across millennials, Gen Z, that now are going to take shape in bigger ways in Gen Alpha.
Yeah, some good commentary on them, because each generation is a reaction to the one that went before. Our times are not if you like, a one-way street where we're heading further and further down in the direction that we're seeing. It's more like a pendulum. Our society, the trends, they swing one way and then they correct and swing the other. And in a sense, therefore, a generation can be a polar to the one that went before. They can be a reaction to what they have seen. They bring a counter trend to the mainstream trends of their parents. And I think that's healthy in a society to just correct the balance and to bring a little bit more balance to maybe a time that we had seen. They're also not only a reaction to the times and shaping it in their own way, but they are global in that empathy and in that connection. I think that's a positive thing. They're more aware of what's happening around the world. It's not just local trends, or for that matter, local fashions that define them in a global world. It's not just Hollywood, it's Bollywood. It's not just the US music scene, it's K-pop coming out of Korea. It's not just Facebook or Instagram, it's TikTok out of China. It's global flows of influence and trends and social media and platforms. And that's part of the world that has shaped them rather than the West exporting culture. It's now the East exporting popular culture and trends and cultural and culinary fashions as well. It's a generation influenced not just by what the experts say or their authority figures, but what the peer groups say. That social influence is very strong. They go for information, not to Google to read an article, but to TikTok to watch a short video. And from a peer group, not necessarily the proven experts. And they're mobile in terms of lifestyle, where they'll work and study. They'll be multi-career, not singular. They'll be post-linear. It's not study and then work and then retirement. They'll mix that up. They'll be plugged into education throughout their life as lifelong learners, and they'll have multiple careers. And beyond that, they're visual in how they consume content. And so the world of the designer and of the aesthetic matters even more for a generation that consumes content and makes decisions in a visual way rather than just a written or a cognitive pattern. And so they're a global, visual, digital, social, mobile generation. And I think some of those factors of these times define them and will certainly define their future.
Mm-hmm. I think one of the biggest conversations that is happening right now in my world is this digital versus physical. And I hate to say that as much as I hate to say Gen Polar, but I think that this is a real friction that's happening right now. These younger generations that were raised as digital natives, now Gen Alpha is going to be raised with AI and just always knowing that. What will the role of the physical environment be? And I think the tension that I'm seeing is with that pendulum swinging, some might feel that we've gone too far digital, especially with hybrid work, remote work. It's wonderful because we can connect literally from across the world as we're doing right now. But we still want these kids to want to show up in real life, face to face. We don't want a Ready Player One scenario where the virtual world is so much better that we go into that to avoid the real world. So given everything that you're seeing in your work, what is your advice to those creating the built environment of tomorrow to make sure we still get them to show up face to face?
The good news is that this generation recognizes, as every previous generation did, that the future is a human-centric one, that even in the future, the most valuable skills will be those people skills, will be those relational skills, will be the timeless human interaction skills. In fact, they are bringing a corrective to the digital obsession, and we're seeing that pendulum come back. This is the first generation of the digital era that have moved from tech optimism to tech skepticism. They see the downsides of technology. They see the impairment. They're the generation raised in a world of digital from their youngest years. They began being born in 2010. That was the year that Instagram was launched and the iPad was released. So they've only ever known a world of the digital, of the visual platforms of social media. And yet they're the first generation to start to use technology to control technology. They're dialing down the use of technology. They're seeing the addictive nature of it. Even the language that is used to describe big tech now, it's not the tech optimists, the utopians of the past. It's the language that they used to describe big tobacco, creating an addictive product, almost commoditizing the users, selling attention. And there's a nefarious perspective that Generation Alpha brings to the intent of technology companies. So they're clear-eyed about technology, about its mixed benefits for human flourishing. Yes, it brings positives, but certainly there are some downsides to it. I think that skepticism, that healthy balance that they bring is great for the future because it means that the future for them will not be fully work from home, will not be fully virtual. They want that balance, and they know that particularly as they're now starting their careers, and they'll be 1 in 5 workers in a decade, so they're fast entering the workplace right now. They're going to need the network to develop the contacts and the mentorships. They're going to need to build those relationships collegiately and cross-generationally. A lot of that learning takes place when we gather as humans, when we're physically there. Those who get the new projects or the opportunities are those who show up. It is harder to delegate or to engage through the digital presence. And if they fully work from home, they know that they will fall a little bit behind the development pathway, the opportunities, the network connections that the previous generation had. And they are on board with a hybrid future. Yes, they want flexibility. They want to decouple work from location. They can do that because of the technology. But they also want to connect and gather and engage. And so I think bringing that balance to our workspaces, to our learning spaces, as to our community spaces is going to be so important. And that really will give a reason for Gen Alpha to show up. It'll create the best of both of those worlds for the future.
So one of the questions I get a lot whenever I even mention Gen Alpha is these kids are so young today. If you think about the earliest of which was born in 2010, they're 15. How do you in your research extrapolate what a 15-year-old is thinking about, or a 10-year-old, or even a 5-year-old, to understand what that might mean for the future workforce, for example?
Yeah, particularly because they're not even going to be hitting their leadership strides, their wealth accumulation life stage, their influence until the middle of this century. So yes, we definitely need to bring our futurist hats, forecast forward. As you said, the listeners here and a lot of sector are developing products that's going to be hitting its life cycle in 40, 50, 60 years. And so we do need to forecast forward. Firstly, we know a lot about a generation, and part of what defines a generation is life stage. And so they are different to the adults because they're in their teenage years. But that's not all that they are. That's not all each of us are by life stage, because we're also who we are because of the times that shaped us. And even though we've all shared the life stage that they have had in terms of being young, being children, being teenagers, we weren't all shaped in that life stage in the 21st century, in this world of technology, in this world of AI. And so that's meaning that their trajectory, their pathway, their education was different to ours. And that's leading to a differential from what we had. Not only are they being shaped in a different time, but they're emerging into a different era with new technologies. They've been shaped with different experiences, different social markers, we call them. The values, the expectations on them are different to what we had. In other words, growing up in the 21st century was growing up in the 90s, different to growing up in the 1970s. And so each generation is different because they're at a different life stage or age, but also because they were shaped in different times. They're emerging into different conditions. The different technologies and events and experiences that they share were different to what we shared. All of that creates significant differences across the generations and really creates those generations. And so we can understand them by studying the times, by looking at the social expectations, by looking at the technology that's formative for them, by looking at the parenting styles that are shaping them. And that gives us a good handle on them. And so, yes, they're technologically savvy, more so than any previous generation. But they're also, as I mentioned, tech skeptical around that. Yes, they're growing up increasingly educated, the most educated generation in history from a formal education perspective. But also their parents are wanting them to develop holistically and don't just see their future as more and more education. They see that actually developing the soft skills and the life skills and the resilience, not just spending longer in an educational conveyor belt, is key. We've seen a shift in parents from saying the future is technology, so robotics and coding, you need all that, to now saying, actually, you need to get outdoors and you need to develop those timeless human skills, and you need to sometimes suffer failure, and hardships are how we learn, not just the helicopter parent and giving everything to you. So we've even seen shifts in parenting that's bringing in those different and timeless character values. So yeah, we can get a good understanding of them by just looking at what the last 10 or 15 years of parenting has shaped them in, how the times are shaping them, and therefore what trajectory they're emerging into. And that gives a reasonable handle on who they'll be in the decade ahead as they move in significant force into the workplace.
We'll be right back after this short break. Hi, listeners. I've got a quick message for you. If you like diving into the moments that truly shape people's lives, you'll love the Just a Moment podcast, hosted by my friend, Brant Menswar, best-selling author, keynote speaker, and all-around powerhouse. This show brings you intimate, unforgettable stories from world-class guests, athletes, entrepreneurs, musicians, and more. Each episode uncovers life-changing moments that define who the guests are. And if you're looking for a good place to start, check out Brant's interview with me, Amanda Schneider. You can listen to Just a Moment at surroundpodcast.com or wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for sticking with us. Now, let's return to the ideas shaping the future.
I'm curious to dive into how you would recommend our listeners leverage this generational research. Because in some cases in the past, I think especially with millennials, this generational conversation was almost weaponized. It was stereotyping them to say this is what they want. And it led to this feeling of, for them to get this, then somebody older has to give up this. So give advice to our audience, especially knowing that they're trying to construct these environments. Why is this research so helpful, and how should they be thinking about it?
Firstly, we need to understand the complexity, the nuance, the subtleties here, and not just stereotype, not just put all of these globally 2.1 billion generation alphas into the one category, because of course there's massive variance within and there's similarities across the generations. But also understand that there's contradictions within a generation here. Like they're growing up as the largest demographic in the history of the world, 2.1 billion. There are 2.9 million births taking place every week globally, right? So this is a big generation. And yet they're growing up in an aging society because there's a longevity boom in most countries, and even in the emerging nations, there's a declining birth rate. It's a time of massive growth of young people and yet an aging population of significant demographic increase, the largest in history, and yet a declining birth rate of a generation growing up as the most technological, even at the time that they push back on technology, that are growing up as global citizens. That global influence defines them, and yet we're seeing rising nationalism and a connection of what it means to belong and to identify within a nation state. So these are some of the complexities and contradictions we need to understand about their times and about this generation, and not take a simplistic view that it's the TikTok generation that are sort of a little bit lightweight, they're not digging deep, and hey, we need help for the future because there's no resilience anymore. That does not understand the true strengths of this generation and the true depth of the complexity and characteristics of them. So I'd say the first step for the older generations is to understand this younger generation, because with understanding comes empathy, comes a connection, comes the ability to engage and communicate. Secondly, we need to understand them, not so we can just communicate with them or put something to them. We've got to engage and connect in that collegiate sense. We've got to not push something on them, but engage with them and get them to help shape something. In other words, the generations used to be hierarchical. The older generations with the experience and the knowledge used to pass that on to the younger generations. The older generations were the leaders, the younger generations were the new entrants. But now we're seeing a shift from that stratification where we've got a mix of generations connected. We've got flatter structures. Even in the household, the younger generations, the kids, have a bit more empowerment and often are shaping even parental decisions as to which school they go to or what car is purchased or where they go on holiday. We're seeing an empowerment of a new generation. It's young people in our society that are driving the popular culture, that are determining the emerging platforms, that advertisers are trying to understand. In other words, they have asymmetrical power, influence, even economic power beyond their own earnings. And so that means we've got to move away from hierarchical structures to more empowering platforms, listening, connecting across the generations, not just down those hierarchies. And the final thing I would say is that if we listen to engage, if we connect across the generations, rather than have that hierarchical sense, is to give real voice to this generation, is to recognize the strengths. Because yes, the older generations bring greater experience, maybe greater stability because their knowledge in the sector. But the younger generations bring strengths in their own right. They're more intuitive to the technology. They understand their generation better than we do. They're connected to these current times because they're shaped in them a little bit more than we are. And so that strength of the digital, of the connection of the next generational view is so important to bring into that equation. And so by recognizing that each generation brings strengths that is best shared in a collegiate sense, and that through listening we build that empathy and understanding, I think those aspects really help us lead multi-generationally and lead empathically and lead with that sense of openness and engagement more than the leadership styles of the past.
Yeah, I love that. And I recently did a talk that's now on TED.com. I know you're a TED speaker as well. I've watched yours, really well done. One of the things that I talked about in my talk was the Gucci shadow board. I'm sure you've familiar with this, but for any of our listeners who are not, Gucci recognized that its sales were declining as its core demographic was aging. And so they put in place this next gen shadow board that helped them grow their sales by 136% during the same time period. Their closest competitor declined 11.5%. So that's a really tangible example of a structure of how you can leverage the insight of these next generations without just putting them into power. Do you have any other stories that you've heard of structures that companies have really been able to harness the power of these next generations without just making them a CEO 10 days into their tenure?
Yeah, that's a great example, Amanda. And I think that's part of sometimes the challenge. We misinterpret this generation's ambition and we say, oh, they want to be CEO in 10 days. They want your job. They expect it all to be given to them. No, they definitely have a desire to learn more and to influence more, to have greater impact. And that comes often with those new responsibilities. So how can we harness that enthusiasm rather than trying to crush it and hold them down? Because they bring great strengths, and we need to encourage that dynamism, that ambition, and that courage to step out. So the first way is mentoring. We often think that mentor is older person shares with younger person, experienced person passes on their knowledge to junior person or a new person. But actually, mentoring is at its best when it's conversational and when it flows both ways, because we all know there's a big generation gap, and we need to learn to understand from the younger generations. And so that mentoring definitely is at its best when it flows both ways, that reverse mentoring, that cross connection where both generations share across the gap what can be learned. That's very healthy, and that's beneficial for all concerned. Secondly, it's recognizing that they can have impact and new opportunities without necessarily a new role in terms of a promotion. We still think in terms of 20th century structures. So you want something new, you've got to earn the right to get that new promotion, to climb the corporate ladder. But it's not a corporate ladder, it's more of a jungle gym. It's not just climbing up, it's moving to the side, it's gaining different experiences, it's moving and twisting this way and that. Now, that's the 21st century mindset of this generation. They just want experiences. It might not be an official step up, but maybe it's organizing the next training day, or it's giving them opportunities to conduct a project where they're trying to understand the changing customer needs. It's maybe giving them that side project, that entrepreneurial opportunity to shape something, to build that think tank and see what comes of it. This is a very entrepreneurial generation, and many of them will not just look for a job in the future, they'll create their own job. Right? It's the era of the side hustle, of gig economy, of having something on the side they want to shape and build, because they don't just want to work within traditional structures. But I say, rather than have them leave our organizations and become an entrepreneur, an external builder, I want to have them an intrapreneur, that is an entrepreneur within our organization, because then they get the best of both worlds. They can shape something and build something, but within the security of employment and the guidance that creates, and indeed the resourcing that we can give if they stick within the established organization. So let's not hold them to those traditional structures. Give them the sandpit and the resourcing to build out and develop that thing that's maybe beyond our expertise. It's maybe not as intuitive to us. It might be an AI project. It might be a connecting with the next gen project. Maybe it's new branding or new concepts. Maybe it's thought leadership or something we want to try. Fantastic. Who better than an entrepreneurial 21st century generation who are ambitious to try something, and we can give them that opportunity to shape us. So it's thinking in new ways, it's understanding new structures, it's recognizing their potential, it's mentoring that goes both ways, it's offering new project opportunities and thinking about an entrepreneurial structure within an existing corporate style, and therefore giving new opportunities. So I think it's this out-of-the-box thinking that's really going to get the best from this next generation. And what we found is the reason that they're leaving organizations is not because there's a compelling reason to leave, but often there's no compelling reason to stay. It's not that there's a push factor, a toxic workplace that blow up with the boss, that's why they're going. It's just that there's no pull factor. We're not giving them the reasons to re-engage. And unless they have a reason to stay, they're going to drift. So we need to be proactive in that way.
Mm-hmm. I love that. And in fact, one of the stats that I came across said that 65% of Gen Alpha are expected to work in jobs that don't currently exist. Does that align with your research?
Yeah, it sure does. And our forecasts are they'll have 16 separate employers, jobs in their lifetime across maybe 6 to 7 different careers. So they'll be truly upskilling and retraining throughout their life. So with all of that change and dynamics of a career, of a pathway, we need to be re-engaging and helping, as you mentioned there, shape what might be those future roles or areas that don't even yet exist, and who better to help future-proof our organizations and set a direction beyond what we're currently seeing than this emerging generation.
And do you see that as a positive? Because I came across a career builder study that said the average tenure for Gen Z would be 2 years, 3 months. But the average tenure for boomers in that same study is now 8 years, 3 months. So it sounds like it's going to be even shorter for Alpha. Is this a good thing or a bad thing for our society, this perceived less loyalty?
Yeah, it's got pluses and minuses, but whether it's good or it's bad, it is the reality. We do have shorter tenure with this generation, shorter tenure in their employment roles and shorter tenure in their careers. And so what that means is that we have to extend that. Now, we might not get to the 10-year long service leave or the 20-year company veteran that was a little bit more observable in the past, but we can do better than the 2 years and 3 months. And with the right sort of leadership and opportunities, we can double that or treble that. And the fact is, we're going to need those long-term experienced people in our organizations, even in the future, because sometimes you can only develop those true deep skills over time. You can't just cram it and it doesn't come in 2 years. You need to move through a few cycles of the economy to be a good leader. You need to see some of the fashions and waves in a sector to really know what's a fad and what's the future. And that comes with long-term tenure. So we need to do better than the 2 years, 3 months, and we can by offering training, by re-engaging, by offering that mentoring, by giving those new opportunities. Now, even if it doesn't get to the 8, 10, or 12 years, but we end up averaging out in our organizations at the 5 to 7 years, that's good going. We can work with that. Mm-hmm. It also tells us that we have to be a bit more proactive in getting them job ready or adding value in a shorter period. Because if they were in the past staying the 8 or 9 years, you could have someone on a 2-year sort of graduate program. You could have them cycling around the organization, learning this area and that area. But these days, we need to accelerate that so that within 4 weeks or 6 weeks, they're adding value, because they may only stay those 2 years. If we have them on a 2-year sort of induction training program, internships, then they're leaving before they've even added day one of value. So we need to get more efficient in that. We need to accelerate that training. And for their sake, they've spent longer in formal education anyway. They don't want more, if you like, desk-bound training. They want to start adding value. We need them to add value and add productivity. So let's get more efficient with our training. And let's keep re-engaging with them, because they're passive job seekers. They're not leaving, as I said, because there's a reason to leave, but if there's no reason to stay, they might move on. Think about them as employed volunteers. If we're not giving them the right opportunities, they might look elsewhere, because they're coming into our organizations in a time of an aging workforce, increased retirements, more jobs than people and more opportunities. And so we really need to keep on the front foot of re-engaging with them to maintain them. And if we get that right, we can get better tenure, we can get still the longevity, we can get the value adding. And I think they'll be adding more because we've been more intentional in equipping them with the right skills to add value as well.
I want to take that back to something you said earlier, this entrepreneurship. If we can design training and upskilling that matches with the way they learn, right? You mentioned something about YouTube. They're going to go find it, right? So really revising that training and upskilling, but also maybe giving that jungle gym structure within your own company. So it's more like levels of a video game rather than being a hierarchical path where you just got to do time and seat, which is going to help them lose the interest.
Yeah.
So I'd love to know, you do a ton of research. You're one of the foremost experts in generations, period. What is one idea or insight that has recently just changed the way you think about the future?
Firstly, I think it's thinking about, for those developing the spaces of the future, the places we will collaborate and connect, whether that be workplaces, community spaces, or homes. It's recognizing that the future is still an embodied one. It is a connective one. And our places define us. It was Winston Churchill in the big rebuild post-World War II that said to the British society, as they were starting the rebuild program, he said, we shape our buildings and afterwards our buildings shape us. And there's something about that. So we need to think about what is the pedagogy of the future? What are the buildings that are going to shape our learning and shape our values and shape our perspectives? And if we build spaces that are totally just pragmatic, that are just in this time because we've got efficiencies, we've got more demand than supply, so we need to accelerate it. And we create spaces that are just purely utilitarian, that are purely transactional. That's short-sighted and creates a bad message for the future, rather than learning from the past and saying we need beautiful spaces and spaces that lift the human psyche and that develop ambition and that say human flourishing matters and people matter and beauty is essential in our built environment as it is clearly in the natural environment. So I would say that we need a design aesthetic for the future that really speaks the language of this generation, that helps facilitate what we want to see: more collaboration, more connection, more engagement, particularly in a world where we drift naturally to the digital and to the online, to create the reason for this generation to get off the device and get out there, to facilitate those community spaces of the future. In the past, those community spaces, those social mediating organizations were religious. They were the community organizations, they were the town halls, they were the village squares. So what is that of the future? What can we build that is going to draw us to connect cross-generationally, to engage across the diversity, to connect locally in our geographies and professionally in our spaces? And it can't just be commercial spaces in terms of food courts or malls. It's got to be those third spaces beyond that. And let's think modular, because we can't with great certainty understand what the 2050s will be. We know who will be there, but they'll have changed. So if we think in terms of modularity, in terms of flexibility, in terms of adaptability, then the current designs that we have, the hard infrastructure, can be shifted and adapted to future needs. And let's face it, we're in a dynamic future. Change is coming quicker. The acceleration of trends is faster. The life cycle is shorter. So we need that flexibility to be inbuilt into our physical structures so that we don't have to tear it down and rebuild it. We can just adapt it to future needs in these fast-moving times. And finally, I would say, let's think globally more than ever. Let's learn from what's happening in other parts. We do tend to look to our own traditions and to our own locales, but this is a generation that is more connected globally than ever. If something's happening over there, they're going to know about it right here, right now, because it spreads virally and instantly, and they see it visually. So let's learn from the best of what's happening globally. Let's apply cross-discipline pathways. If it's happening in food, it might have an impact in design. If there's something in the music or the culture over there, it'll create ripples, even in the built spaces over here. So let's think in terms of that cross-discipline, cross-cultural, and cross-generational divide to create usable, flexible, adaptive spaces of the future that'll connect with all, that'll be relevant even into the 2050s and the 2060s, because that's sustainability, that's efficiency, and that's future-proofing. And I think we can learn a lot from how the Gen Alphas are living.
I love that. And it feels like a lot of this comes back to this agency. You talk about that with their careers and being this entrepreneurial generation. It feels like they may be that way with their space too. Really, how am I able to customize that to what I need? And I think that's going to get even stronger as more people are not working 9 to 5 days in one set location. We're going to have to reimagine that.
You know, it's often been said that the artist sees the future before the politician and the philosopher sees it before the economist. And I think we can extend that and say Generation Alpha sees the future before the Gen Xer does, because they're more intuitive in the changing times and the culture. We all live in the same time. We don't all have the same lens. And that's where I think this next generation really needs a seat at the table, because they'll bring a different perspective, a 21st century one. We're living in the 21st century, but we were shaped in the 20th. And so we bring that structured thinking and that mindset. They are intuitive to these times. So let's have them have a seat at the table. And then I think together we can better see the future and design the future with them involved and an active part of it.
Brilliant. Let me ask one more closing question here. Fast forward to 2040. What is one radical possibility that you could imagine for the future? Maybe something that feels wild now, but could actually happen.
A blurring of our categories. We still, and for a century of education, have our schools as separate to the rest of life. we, for some reason, have our educational precincts separated from our commercial ones, from our work-based ones. And maybe it's because there's been a skepticism of not wanting commercial or advertising or profit-making entering into our learning spaces, and I can understand that. But it's so segmented for a generation that is so integrated. They are studying while they are working. They are designing commercial opportunities, side hustle earnings, even while they're learning, and even in the junior or middle schools. So why do we have such segmented educational spaces from earning spaces, the commercial spaces, and the employment spaces? Part of the big reason we have a gap as people move from learning to earning, and some of them fall through the cracks and never get into employment, is that we're not integrated. And so they're used to 13 years of education, but they've got no idea how to apply that into the earning space, the career space, because other than having the careers advisors or those career counselors, and even that's a little bit one-dimensional, we haven't integrated. So I see in the mid-century, our learning fully integrated into earning. That is, our educational spaces connecting so well with the best of the entrepreneurial spaces, the incubators that are creating the startups, the commercial end of town, really sponsoring because they're developing great learning, great training. They're good at educating. That's why they have maintained great profitability and educated the next generation of professionals. And so let's bring some of that into the education space. Why would the future of education purely be in the hands of the academic educators? They are professionals and excellent, but they can learn a lot from the business leaders, from the commercial, from the startups, from the entrepreneurs, from the tech experts. And I think the future will be more collaborative, where we'll have these learning precincts where startups, entrepreneurs, and tech and corporates connect and input and shape the future of learning as well. And I'd love to see that, so that our spaces are cross-disciplinary and we learn and engage and earn and connect in these multi-use precincts. And I see that as something more of the future.
And that's how we kick off Season 8, Tomorrow's Impact. Conversations like this remind me why I love doing this show, because they give us a glimpse of tomorrow and the impact that we have in shaping it. So if you've made it this far, thank you, truly. My hope is that something you heard today will stick with you and maybe even shift the way you see what's ahead. I do have one small ask before you go. If this conversation resonated with you in any way, please follow the show. Better yet, leave a review. It may seem like a small action, but it's how these ideas reach more and more people who care about shaping the future. So thanks for listening. I'm really glad you're here. Design Nerds Anonymous is a proud member of the Surround Podcast Network. Special thanks to the podcast production team, Hannah Vitti, Rachel Senator, and Rob Schulte.